The ballroom felt less like a room and more like a statement. Perched on the 50th floor of a gleaming tower that pierced the city skyline, it was a world of glass and steel, of polished marble floors so reflective they seemed to be holding a second, darker party below. Outside, the city sprawled like a carpet of scattered diamonds, a silent, glittering universe that the people inside seemed to command. This was the annual gala for the most powerful tech company on the planet, an event less about celebration and more about a quiet, unspoken display of dominance. The air hummed with a low thrum of conversation, the constant, delicate clinking of ice against crystal, and the soft, atmospheric music that was designed to be heard but never truly noticed. It was the sound of money, the sound of success. The guests themselves were a carefully curated collection of the city's most influential. They moved in small, tight-knit circles, their smiles practiced and their eyes constantly scanning, assessing, evaluating. A woman in a silk dress that probably cost more than a car laughed at something a man with a perfectly trimmed beard said, but her eyes had already moved on, landing on a potential investor across the room. A young man, fresh out of business school and still wearing a suit that felt a little too big for him, clutched a champagne flute and tried to look like he belonged. His gaze fixed on the powerful figures who floated through the crowd with an effortless grace. He was hoping, praying for just one handshake, one moment of eye contact that could change his life. In this world, a single introduction was worth more than a year of hard work. And then, a subtle shift. The hum of the crowd quieted just a fraction, like a tide pulling back before a wave. The man of the hour had arrived. He didn't make a grand entrance. He simply appeared, as if materializing out of the collective ambition of the room. He was the CEO, the architect of this entire empire, a man whose name was spoken in boardrooms from Silicon Valley to Shanghai. He was in his late 40s, with sharp, angular features that looked like they had been carved from granite. His suit was a perfect charcoal gray, tailored so impeccably it seemed like a second skin. There wasn't a single hair out of place on his head, but it was his eyes that truly defined him. They were a cool, piercing gray, and they moved over the room not with warmth, but with the cold, precise efficiency of a scanner reading data. He didn't look at people. He processed them. As he moved through the crowd, a path cleared for him automatically. People stepped aside, offering respectful nods and murmured greetings. He acknowledged them with the barest tilt of his head, his lips never quite forming a smile. He was a king surveying his kingdom, and while his subjects were loyal, they were also rightly a little afraid. The young executive in the ill-fitting suit saw his chance and stepped forward, his hand outstretched, his heart pounding in his chest. "Sir," he managed to say, his voice a little shaky. "An honor." The CEO stopped. He took the young man's hand. His grip was firm, dry, and over in a second. His eyes, however, had already darted past the young man's shoulder, locking onto a rival CEO across the room. The handshake was a formality, a glitch in his operating system. The young man was left with his hand hanging in the air, a sudden cold wave of insignificance washing over him. He had been seen but not looked at. He had been processed and found wanting. After what felt like an eternity of circulating, the CEO made his way to the stage. The soft background music faded completely, and a single, warm spotlight found him, illuminating him against the massive, dark window that served as a backdrop. He stood behind a sleek, minimalist podium, the company's sleek, abstract logo glowing softly on its front. This was his element. Out there, among the people, he seemed almost uncomfortable, a predator forced into a social setting. But here, on the stage, under the lights, he was in total control. He was the conductor of this orchestra of power. The room fell silent, all eyes on him. The journalist in the front row, a woman who had been covering him for a decade and had never once been granted a one-on-one interview, picked up her pen, her expression cynical. She knew this speech by heart. She had heard variations of it a dozen times. He began to speak, his voice clear and steady, perfectly calibrated to carry to every corner of the vast room without a microphone. It was a voice of absolute confidence. "Thank you for being here tonight," he started, the standard pleasantry. We stand at the precipice of a new era. An era defined not by the limitations of the past, but by the boundless potential of the future. He spoke of market share, of disruptive technologies, of leveraging synergies to create new paradigms. It was a symphony of corporate jargon, delivered with the passionless precision of a master craftsman. The audience nodded along. They were impressed by the numbers, by the sheer scale of his vision, but they weren't moved. It was brilliant, but it was cold. It was like admiring a beautifully complex machine. You could appreciate its design, but you couldn't feel its heart. He clicked a small remote, and a giant screen behind him lit up with graphs and charts. Lines shot upwards, bars grew, and percentages flashed in bold, triumphant green. "This isn't just growth," he said, his voice rising slightly with the only hint of emotion he had shown so far. "This is a revolution. We are not just creating technology. We are architecting the very fabric of tomorrow's reality." The journalist sighed silently and scribbled a note. Same old story. Impressive numbers, zero humanity. The young executive in the back, having recovered from his snub, watched with awe. He didn't see a cold machine. He saw a god. He wanted to be that man, to have that power, to command a room with nothing but words and data. He saw the end, not the means. He saw the victory, not the cost. The CEO continued, painting a picture of a world streamlined, optimized, and perfected by his company's algorithms. A world without friction, without inefficiency. It was a seductive vision, and the room was captivated by its sheer audacity. He spoke for 20 minutes, a masterclass in corporate communication. Every gesture was measured, every pause was for effect. He was a performer, and this was his show. As he neared the end of his prepared remarks, the audience prepared for the familiar conclusion. They expected the final, inspiring call to action, the polite, predictable wave of applause, and then the return to the soft music and clinking glasses. They could already feel themselves shifting in their seats, their minds moving on to the next conversation, the next deal, but then something strange happened. He finished his last sentence, a powerful statement about owning the future, and instead of stepping back and basking in the impending applause, he went silent. He stood there, perfectly still, his hands resting on the podium. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable. A few people began to clap hesitantly, but the sound died out quickly when they realized no one else was joining in. The room was filled with a confused, buzzing energy. People looked at each other, their eyebrows raised. Was this a technical glitch? Had he forgotten his next line? The journalist leaned forward, her cynicism momentarily replaced by genuine intrigue. This was not part of the script. Slowly, deliberately, the CEO pushed his notes aside. They were just a prop anyway. He knew every word by heart. He took a deep breath, and for the first time that night, his gaze softened. He looked out at the sea of faces, not as data points to be processed, but as people. The cool, analytical mask seemed to crack, just a little, revealing something unexpected underneath. When he spoke again, his voice was different. It was lower, quieter, almost hesitant. "But numbers," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it commanded the room's absolute attention. "Numbers don't tell the whole story. They don't tell you about the beginning. They don't tell you about the foundations." A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. This was new territory. He was deviating from the program, and it was both thrilling and unnerving. He paused again, gathering his thoughts, his eyes distant, as if looking at something far beyond the glass wall, something deep in his own past. "We talk about building the future," he continued, his voice gaining a little strength, but with a new, unfamiliar warmth. "But no one builds anything alone. No one achieves anything, truly achieves anything. In a vacuum, there are always people who shape us. People who give us the tools, not the software and hardware, but the real tools. The ones you can't see." The room was now completely silent, the air thick with anticipation. The journalist's pen was poised, ready to capture this unprecedented moment. He leaned forward slightly, his hands gripping the edge of the podium. The powerful, untouchable CEO was gone, replaced by a man who seemed, for the first time, vulnerable. "Tonight," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that no one in that room had ever heard from him before. I want to do something different. I want to step away from the spreadsheets and the stock prices. I want to introduce you to someone. A person who is more responsible for whatever success I have achieved than anyone else in this room or in this entire company. He looked up, his eyes scanning the crowd, and a small, almost sad smile touched his lips. He is my mystery guest. The words hung in the air, a bombshell of pure curiosity. A murmur, loud and electric, swept through the ballroom. Every mind was racing. Who was this person? A secret mentor? A political heavyweight? A rival tech genius he was about to ally? The CEO's words seemed to suck all the air out of the room. He is my mystery guest. The phrase echoed in the sudden, stunned silence, a puzzle wrapped in an enigma. The collective mind of the ballroom, a hive of some of the sharpest and most competitive intellects in the world, went into overdrive. The murmuring that followed was not a polite buzz. It was a low, excited, and intensely speculative roar. Fingers flew across phones, hidden under tables, sending messages that would light up social media in minutes. Who was it? A former president? A reclusive tech visionary who hadn't been seen in public for a decade? The rival CEO he was rumored to be in secret talks with? The theories were wild, grand, and befitting the stage that had been set. The CEO stood perfectly still behind the podium, a small, knowing smile now playing on his lips. He was enjoying this. The power he held wasn't just in his company's market cap. It was in the complete and undivided attention of 1,000 people who were used to being the ones everyone else watched. He let the suspense build, letting the waves of speculation crash against the stage. He was no longer the cold, calculating machine from his speech. He was a showman, a master puppeteer, and he was holding all the strings. Then, with a subtle nod to a technician in the shadows, the main stage lights dimmed. A single, sharp spotlight cut through the darkness, aiming not at the grand center entrance, but at a small, unassuming door tucked away at the side of the stage. The effect was immediate. All eyes swiveled to the pool of light. The door creaked open, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. The figure that emerged was so unexpected, so out of place, that for a moment many people thought it was a joke. A mistake. It was an old man. Very old. He shuffled forward with the hesitant, careful steps of someone who trusted the ground beneath his feet just a little less each day. He was stooped, his shoulders rounded forward as if carrying a great, invisible weight. He wore a tweed jacket that had seen better decades, its elbows patched with a slightly different shade of brown, and a pair of faded gray trousers that were a little too short, revealing bony, pale ankles and scuffed leather shoes that had likely never known a shoeshine. His hair was a thin, wispy cloud of white, and in his hand he clutched not a leather briefcase or a tablet, but a worn, battered guitar case covered in faded stickers and travel stickers from places no one went for business anymore. A confused silence fell over the room, deeper and more profound than before. This was not a rival mogul. This was not a political icon. This looked like someone who had wandered in off the street looking for the bus station. A few titters of laughter, sharp and cruel, rippled through the crowd from the tables near the front, where the most cynical and status-conscious guests sat. The woman in the silk dress leaned over to her companion and whispered something behind her hand, her face a mask of disdainful amusement. The young executive in the back, however, just stared, his brow furrowed in confusion. He didn't understand. This wasn't the power he aspired to. This was confusing, but the reaction that mattered was the CEO's. As soon as the old man appeared, the CEO's entire demeanor transformed. The powerful, commanding figure vanished. In his place was a man who seemed almost humbled. He moved quickly from behind the podium, his polished shoes making no sound on the carpeted stage. He didn't walk. He hurried. He reached the old man's side just as the man seemed to stumble slightly on a step. The CEO caught his arm with a gentleness that was shocking to see. It was a gesture of pure, unguarded care, the kind a son might show a father, He spoke to the old man in a low voice, too quiet for the audience to hear, but the warmth in his expression was visible, even from the back of the room. He guided the old man slowly, carefully, to the center of the stage where a simple, unadorned wooden chair had been placed. The CEO had clearly planned this. As he helped the old man sit, making sure he was comfortable, the snickering in the audience died completely. The cynical smiles faded, replaced by looks of utter bewilderment. The scene was so intimate, so real, so utterly at odds with the glitz and artificiality of the gala that it felt like watching a private moment in a public square. The journalist in the front row was scribbling furiously, her mind racing. This wasn't a business story anymore. This was something else entirely. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it was huge. Once the old man was settled, the CEO returned to the microphone. He looked out at the sea of stunned faces, and for the first time, his eyes held a challenge. He was daring them to judge, daring them to laugh. He stood there for a long moment, letting the image of the frail old man in the worn-out jacket, sitting alone on the massive stage, sink in. The contrast was almost painful. The gleaming modernity of the room, the symbols of immense wealth and power, all of it was background noise to this simple, powerful image. Then the CEO spoke. His voice was steady, but it carried an undercurrent of deep, resonant emotion that hadn't been there before. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his gaze sweeping across the room, making eye contact with anyone who dared to look away. "This is a man who taught me everything that matters." He paused, letting the weight of that statement land. "Everything." He gestured towards the old man, who was now looking down at his hands resting in his lap, seemingly unaware of the hundreds of eyes on him. "His name is not important. His story is, but tonight he is not here to talk. He is here to do what he does best." The CEO took a deep breath, and a look of profound pride and love washed over his face. "He's going to play for you." The words hung in the air, absurd and impossible. "Play? Here? Now?" The collective gasp was audible. "Play what?" The old man slowly reached down and fumbled with the latches on his guitar case. The soft click-clack of the metal clasps opening was the only sound in the cavernous room. He lifted the lid, and inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was an old acoustic guitar, its wood scuffed and scratched, its finish worn smooth in places from decades of use. It looked as well-loved and as broken in as its owner. The CEO stepped back into the shadows, leaving the old man and his guitar alone in the spotlight. The performance was about to begin, and no one in the room had any idea what they were about to hear. The old man's hands, though they trembled slightly at rest, moved with a quiet, practiced certainty as they lifted the guitar from its case. It was an extension of him, a familiar weight in his lap. He ran a thumb over the worn wood, a gesture so intimate it felt like he was greeting an old friend. For a moment he just sat there, his head bowed, his fingers resting on the strings. The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning, a sound that had been invisible before but now seemed intrusive. The audience, 1,000 masters of the universe, were frozen, their collective breath held in suspense. They were waiting for a punchline, for an explanation, for something to make sense of this bizarre scene. Then his fingers moved. They didn't strike the strings with the force of a performer trying to command a room. Instead, they coaxed the sound out. The first few notes were tentative, like a question asked in a dark room. A simple, melancholic chord hung in the air, raw and a little out of tune. It was the opposite of the perfect, synthesized sound that had filled the room earlier. This was imperfect. It was human. A few people in the crowd shifted in their seats, their discomfort palpable. This wasn't what they came for. The woman in the silk dress exchanged a look with her companion, a roll of her eyes that said, "Get on with it." But then the old man began to play in earnest. The melody that emerged was not complex or showy. It was a simple folk tune, the kind you might hear around a campfire or in a dusty, forgotten bar. Yet there was a depth to it, a haunting quality that seemed to bypass the intellect and speak directly to something much older and deeper inside. The notes flowed like a slow, dark river, each one carrying a weight of unspoken stories. The sound was so out of place in the gleaming, modern ballroom that it created a strange, powerful dissonance. It was like finding a wildflower growing through a crack in a concrete sidewalk. As the melody settled in, the old man began to sing. His voice was not smooth or trained. It was gravelly, frayed at the edges like an old piece of cloth, and it cracked on the higher notes. But it was filled with a truth that was more compelling than any perfect pitch. He sang about concrete walls and a metal door that slammed shut. He sang of a boy with fists full of anger and a heart full of stone, a boy who didn't know how to talk, only how to fight. The lyrics were simple, direct, and painted a picture of a bleak, colorless world. The journalist in the front row found her pen frozen halfway to her notepad. She had come here to write about corporate strategy and market projections. This was something else entirely. She found herself leaning forward, her cynical detachment melting away. The song was peeling back layers not just on the CEO, but on the very nature of success and power. She glanced around the room and saw the same transformation happening everywhere. The hard, calculating expressions were softening. The constant checking of phones had stopped completely. The room was being held captive, not by a display of power, but by a display of profound vulnerability. The old man sang another verse, and this time a new character entered the story. A quiet voice, a worn-out piece of wood. He sang of a man who didn't try to fix the angry boy, but just sat with him day after day and showed him how to turn his pain into something beautiful. You can't just break the strings, son, the lyrics went. You gotta learn to pull them tight. You gotta find the music in the fight. The words hung in the air, and suddenly a connection began to form in the minds of the audience. Their eyes darted from the old man on the stage to the CEO standing in the shadows. The story wasn't just a song. It was a biography. The young executive in the back felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent his life idolizing men like the CEO, trying to emulate their strength, their ruthlessness, their impenetrable armor. But this song was showing him a different kind of strength. The strength to admit you were once broken. The strength to honor the person who helped put you back together. He looked at the CEO, who was no longer a distant, godlike figure. In the dim light, the young man could see the CEO's shoulders were slumped, his head bowed. He wasn't the master of the universe anymore. He was just that boy from the song, listening to the story of his own salvation. Even the woman in the silk dress was captivated. The practiced, dismissive smile had vanished from her face, replaced by an expression of raw, unguarded emotion. The song was touching something in her, a memory she had long buried. Perhaps it reminded her of a time before the designer dresses and the charity galas, a time when life was simpler and maybe a little more real. She saw her reflection in the polished surface of the table and for a moment didn't recognize the person staring back. The music was a mirror, and it was showing her all the things she had lost on her way up. As the song reached its climax, the old man's frailty seemed to fall away. He closed his eyes, his head tilted back, and his voice, though still rough, soared with a surprising power. He wasn't just singing anymore. He was testifying. His fingers flew across the fretboard, the worn-out guitar producing a sound that was both fierce and beautiful. It was the sound of struggle, of resilience, of a spirit that refused to be broken. The performance was technically flawed, emotionally perfect. It was the most real thing anyone in that room had ever experienced. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. He struck the final chord and let it hang in the air, its vibrations slowly fading into a profound, echoing silence. No one moved. No one spoke. 1,000 people, who had built their lives on noise and action and constant communication, sat in complete, utter stillness. The air in the ballroom felt different, thicker, charged with a shared, powerful emotion. The old man opened his eyes and looked down at his guitar, as if surprised to find himself there. The CEO remained in the shadows, a solitary, unmoving figure. The silence stretched on, not because it was awkward, but because no one wanted to be the first one to break the spell. They had just witnessed something sacred, and they were all, for the first time in a very long time, humbled. The silence in the ballroom was a living thing. It stretched on, thick and heavy. a shared breath held by 1,000 people who had forgotten the world outside the four walls of the room. The old man sat with his guitar, his head bowed, as if he had poured every last drop of his life force into the song and was now just an empty vessel. The single spotlight felt like a confessional, and the entire audience was privy to a secret they never asked to hear, but now couldn't imagine living without. Then a movement. The CEO stepped out of the shadows. He walked slowly, deliberately, back to the center of the stage. His face was no longer a mask of cold, polished control. It was raw, open, and glistening with tears he made no attempt to hide. The powerful, untouchable titan was gone. In his place was a man laid bare, his soul exposed under the bright, unforgiving lights. He reached the microphone and placed a hand on the stand to steady himself, his knuckles white. He looked out at the crowd, his gaze sweeping over their stunned faces. He saw the journalist, her pen poised, her own eyes suspiciously bright. He saw the young executive looking at him not with awe, but with a newfound, profound empathy. He saw the woman in the silk dress, her perfect composure shattered, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. He saw them all, truly saw them, for the first time. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He cleared his throat, a gesture so human, so clumsy, it was more powerful than any word he could have said. Finally, his voice emerged, thick and rough, like gravel scraping against pavement. "That boy in the song," he began, his voice cracking on the last word. He had to stop, take a breath, and compose himself. "That boy?" "Was me." A collective, almost inaudible gasp swept through the room. It wasn't a gasp of surprise, but of confirmation. Everyone had suspected it, but hearing the words from his lips made it real, made it undeniable, he continued, his voice gaining a little strength, fueled by the honesty of the moment. That old door was the door to my room in a group home? That anger? That was my only currency. I was a kid the world had thrown away, and I was determined to throw the world right back. He looked over at the old man, who was now looking up at him, a tired, proud smile on his face. "And this man," the CEO said, his voice filled with a love so pure it was almost painful to witness. "This was my music teacher. His name is Arthur, and he was the first person in my life who looked at me and didn't see a problem. He saw a possibility." He turned back to the audience, his hands now gripping the microphone stand with both hands. "He didn't teach me about business. He didn't teach me about algorithms or market caps. He taught me something much more important. He taught me that you can't create anything of value without focus, without sacrifice, and without heart. He taught me that to make a beautiful sound, you have to apply pressure, but not too much. You have to know when to pull back and when to push forward. He taught me discipline. Not the kind you learn from a book, but the kind you learn from trying to get a chord right 1,000 times until your fingers bleed." A murmur of understanding rippled through the crowd. They were starting to see it. The connection between the angry boy with a guitar and the ruthless CEO with a global empire. The same principles, just applied on a different scale. "We talk about disruption," the CEO said, his voice growing stronger, more passionate. "We talk about innovation. We spend billions on creating technology that changes the world. But we've forgotten something fundamental. We've forgotten that the most powerful technology we have is the ability to lift another human being up. We've become so obsessed with building the future that we've abandoned the people who are living in the present. The people who are just like that boy in the song, angry, lost, and waiting for someone to teach them how to play their first note." He let that sink in. The room was his, but not in the way it was before. He wasn't commanding their attention. He had earned it. He stepped back from the microphone and stood beside the old man, placing a hand gently on his shoulder. It was a gesture of solidarity, of unity. "That changes tonight," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound conviction. "Not just for me, but for this company. We are going to start using our resources not just to build a better future, but to build better people." He took a deep breath. This was it. The reason for it all. I am proud to announce the launch of the First Note Initiative, a foundation, funded by $1 billion from this company's own reserves. dedicated to one single purpose: providing arts education and mentorship in every underfunded school, community center, and group home in this country. The announcement hit the room like a physical wave. $1 billion. Not for a new campus, not for a research lab, not for a new product line. For music lessons, for painting classes, for drama clubs, for giving angry, lost kids a chance to find their own song. We are going to find teachers like Arthur, he continued, his voice filled with fire. We are going to give them the resources they need. We are going to go into the places the world has forgotten, and we are going to offer not a handout, but a hand up. We are going to teach kids that their anger can be turned into art, that their pain can become a symphony. Because that is the real disruption. That is the real innovation. Changing a life from the inside out. He finished, and for a second, there was silence again. But this time, it was a silence of pure, unadulterated shock. Then, a single person in the back stood up and started clapping. It was the young executive in the ill-fitting suit. His clap was loud, sharp, and full of emotion. Then another person joined in. Then another. Soon, the entire room was on its feet. The applause was not polite. It was not perfunctory. It was a roar, a tidal wave of sound that was part ovation, part catharsis. It was the sound of 1,000 hardened hearts breaking open all at once. The journalist was clapping so hard her hands stung, tears streaming freely down her face. The woman in the silk dress was on her feet, her face a mess of makeup and tears, clapping with a fierce, desperate energy. On the stage the CEO stood, his arms still around the old man's shoulders. He looked out at the roaring crowd, not with pride, but with a sense of quiet peace. He had shared his deepest wound, and in doing so, had begun to heal not just himself, but everyone in that room. The mystery guest hadn't just given a performance that shocked everyone. He had helped a powerful man find his humanity, and in the process, reminded a whole world what it meant to be human. The roar of the applause finally began to fade, but the energy it left behind was something entirely new. It wasn't the polite, satisfied buzz of a successful business event. It was the charged, humbled silence that follows a shared, profound experience. As the stage lights came up, the spell was broken and the world rushed back in. But it was a different world now. People didn't rush to the bar or huddle in their exclusive circles to talk deals. They stood in small, quiet groups, their faces still reflecting the raw emotion they had just witnessed. The woman in the silk dress was no longer a picture of cynical perfection. She was dabbing her eyes with a napkin, talking animatedly with a man she had been trying to avoid all night, their shared vulnerability creating a bridge where there had been none before. The young executive in the back simply stood by his chair, watching as the CEO gently helped the old man off the stage and guided him towards a private exit. He felt a strange sense of peace, a feeling that his own ambitions, which had felt so urgent just an hour ago, had been put into a new, gentler perspective. The journalist was already moving, weaving through the dazed crowd with a newfound urgency. Her cynical notes from the beginning of the evening were a forgotten relic in her purse. This wasn't just a story. It was a revelation. She pushed through the grand doors, not even bothering to grab another glass of champagne, her mind racing. She had to write this. Not the numbers, not the market projections, but the truth. The truth about a broken boy, a kind old man, and a song that had just might change the world. By the time she got to her car, her fingers were flying across her phone's keyboard, dictating the story that would soon be on every front page. The next morning, the world woke up to a different kind of headline. It wasn't about stock prices or product launches. It was about a CEO's soul. The song that changed Silicon Valley, read one headline. $1 billion beats. Tech titan trades algorithms for arts, read another. The story of the CEO and his old music teacher became a global sensation. It was a story that transcended borders and industries. Video clips of the performance, filmed on guests' phones, went viral, viewed millions of times within hours. People weren't just watching. They were sharing their own stories of teachers who had changed their lives, of moments of kindness that had redirected their paths. The CEO's company, once seen as a faceless corporate juggernaut, was suddenly humanized. Its stock price dipped slightly in the morning trading, a knee-jerk reaction from investors who saw $1 billion as a loss. But by the afternoon, as the public goodwill tsunami grew, the stock had recovered, and then some. The company hadn't just invested in a foundation. It had invested in its own soul, and the market was starting to understand that, but not everyone was celebrating. A week later, the CEO found himself in a familiar setting, the cold, sterile boardroom on the top floor of his tower. The view was still breathtaking, the table still polished to a mirror sheen. But the dynamic had shifted. Seated around the table were his board members, their expressions a mixture of concern and outright disapproval. At the head of the table, opposite the CEO, sat a man known for his sharp mind and even sharper tongue. He was a veteran of the corporate world, a man who believed in numbers above all else. $1 billion? The board member said, his voice dripping with condescension. He didn't say it as a question. He said it as an accusation. For what exactly? Guitars? Painting supplies? This is a technology company, not a charity. We have shareholders to answer to. We have a responsibility to maximize profit. The room fell silent. All eyes were on the CEO. This was the test. The old version of him would have responded with charts and projections, with a cold, logical defense that would have steamrolled the opposition. But he wasn't that man anymore. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table, his expression calm but firm. "You're right," he said, surprising everyone in the room. "It is a lot of money. And it is a risk. But it's the best investment this company will ever make." He paused, looking each board member in the eye. "For years we have talked about disruption. We have disrupted industries, we have changed how people communicate, how they shop, how they live, and we have made a fortune doing it. But in the process, we have become part of the problem. We have created a world that is faster, more efficient, but also more disconnected. We have a generation of kids who are more connected to their screens than to each other." He stood up and walked over to the massive window, looking down at the city below. "That song you all saw?" he said, his voice quiet but powerful. "That wasn't just entertainment. That was a diagnostic report. It was a report on a broken system that produces angry, lost kids. I was one of them. And the only reason I'm standing here today is because one man decided to invest his time, not his money, in me. He taught me that the most complex problems can't be solved with an algorithm. They have to be solved with heart, with connection. With art." He turned back to face the stunned boardroom. "So yes, we are investing $1 billion in guitars and paintbrushes. We are investing in giving kids a voice when they think no one is listening. We are investing in turning pain into creativity. And I promise you, the return on that investment won't just be measured in dollars. It will be measured in lives changed. And that is a legacy worth more than any stock price." The room was silent. The sharp-tongued board member leaned back in his chair, a look of grudging respect on his face. He didn't agree, not entirely. But he understood. He was no longer arguing with a CEO. He was arguing with a man on a mission. And that was a much harder fight to win, months later. The CEO was in a place he never thought he would be again, a dusty, underfunded community center in a part of the city he had only ever seen through a car window. The air smelled of old wood and floor wax. In the main hall, a group of teenagers, a mix of tough-looking kids with slumped shoulders and defiant eyes, were gathered in a semicircle. And in the middle of them sat the old man, Arthur, his guitar in his lap, patiently showing a boy with a scowl how to place his fingers on the fretboard. The CEO stood in the doorway, watching from the shadows. He wasn't there to give a speech or to have his picture taken. He was just there to watch. He saw the boy's frustration as his fingers fumbled the chord. He saw the old man's quiet encouragement. Then he saw it. The boy tried again, and this time a clear, clean sound rang out. It was just one note, one simple chord. But the look on the boy's face was a transformation. The scowl vanished, replaced by a flicker of surprise. then a slow, shy smile of pure, unadulterated pride. He had done it. He had made something beautiful. The CEO watched that smile, and he felt a warmth spread through his chest that was more satisfying than any closed deal, any soaring stock price. He thought about the headlines, the board meetings, the $1 billion. None of it mattered as much as this single, perfect moment. The mystery guest hadn't just given a performance that shocked everyone. He had given a powerful man a new song to sing, and the real legacy wasn't the empire he had built, but the small, quiet echoes of that song now being played in rooms like this one all across the country. One chord at a time,